I was reading this week about two really interesting inventions. And so depending on your interest, you may find one of these more interesting than the other. But the first one is something called self-tying shoes. How many of you have heard of these self-tying shoes? Okay, think Back to the Future 2. All right? Self-tying shoes. So Nike is actually launching a new version of its self-tying shoe. They have had a previous one that sold for about $700. But this new version of their self-tying shoe launches in February. And so you can line up to get a pair of these self-tying shoes. They're going to cost you about $350. But they have this amazing ability to decide and determine, the tightness of the shoe around your particular foot. And you can hook up your self-tying shoes to your smartphone. And I'm not kidding. And so you can actually, by the touch of a button, you can control the level of tightness of your shoes. It's amazing. You can charge your shoes, and after one charge, a full charge, they will last 10 to 14 days, and you can use them. Now, these are really geared at athletes, and especially high-performance athletes, because there's a belief that athletes like their shoes a little looser, maybe for warm-ups, a little tighter, maybe for games, depending on whether they're running or playing sports or whatever. They like to be able to adjust their shoes in that way. These shoes were actually worn recently by a player who's a member of the Boston Celtics. Maybe some of you know this, and they played against the Raptors that night. And the Celtics won, therefore, the shoes are a must-own. Okay, so you want to make sure you get a pair of these shoes. Now, the other interesting invention that I was reading about this week, and this fascinates me, is something called self-healing concrete. How many of you have heard of that? Okay, a few of you. Okay, great. Self-healing concrete. So self-healing concrete is a product that is actually used and available, I don't know where, but not common right now. But self-healing concrete has the ability to bend and stretch itself and not break. It's amazing. It also has the ability to repair itself when it comes in contact with water, so think snow or rain. And so experts believe that this self-healing concrete, it has components in it that are found in seashells. And so we've used nature to kind of discover how we can make concrete that is more sustainable and more sturdy. And so experts believe that we can save billions and billions of dollars in maintenance costs because of this product, and that we could erect concrete structures that could withstand natural disasters like earthquakes. It's amazing. So here's my question for you. Which of those two groups of workers that are working on those products are doing godly work? It's very quiet out there. No one wants to guess. Who's doing godly work? The self-tying shoes? Couple nods. Few I'm not answering this, I'm going to get it wrong. And then what about the self-healing concrete? Someone said neither. Here's the thing. It's a trick question, but you knew that, didn't you? So, potentially, both. Or neither. What we've been talking about these first couple weeks is the idea that we were created to do good work. I think both of those products have the potential to be used by God. There's no question in my mind. But the group of workers that are developing and making these products, the good work is not necessarily a result of, the product, but rather a result of them doing the work to add life and value to the people around them. And that's what we've been talking about these last couple of weeks around the idea of work. When work is put in its proper context, it's a way to serve and honor God and each other, and it's a beautiful expression of who God created us to be. One of my first jobs was working as a door-to-door salesperson. It was not amazing. You probably remember someone like me, actually, because this was right around the time when natural gas was deregulated in Ontario. And yeah, there's some people laughing right now. And so I would come to your house as this young, inexperienced guy who didn't really know what he was talking about, and I'd knock on your door, and I'd try to convince you that you should sign up to buy your gas directly from a supplier other than Union Gas. It did not go well. I did not pad my college fund that summer, and I got a lot of doors closed in my face. One particularly memorable experience was when a person came to the door and said, "No hablo inglés," and then had a fluent English conversation after they closed the door on me. And so, I did not do well at that job. It was hot. I was tired. I had very little success. And often my supervisor was trying to convince me to be deceitful, I felt, with the way that I talked about this particular product or service. And it was just not something that I enjoyed, but I'm okay with that. Because I feel like there was nothing really about that job that I took any sense of identity from. It was just a job. Now, fast forward a few years, I had another job. I was working for a couple of years with a heating and cooling company, and we mostly installed furnaces in new homes in the area where I lived. And I was inexperienced. I didn't know anything about the field. I was the young guy, and so I often got stuck with the dirty jobs or the short straw type jobs. I don't know if you've experienced that. Probably you have. But there was one job that I really did enjoy when I was doing that, and that was installing a product called Thermopan. Have any of you heard of Thermopan? I'm the only one. Okay. Wow. Okay, so I'm not feeling quite as good about this now. But so Thermopan, the way Thermopan works, it's like a cardboard covered in aluminum, and it acts as insulation to create return air ducts in the joists in your ceilings and the studs in your walls. And I'm telling you, it is not brain surgery, but you had to practice. I mean, you needed to know how to measure, how to cut the product properly, to fold it, to install it so that it worked at its very best. And I got pretty good at installing Thermopan. To the point where I was so proficient at it that my coworkers came up with a nickname for me. You're going to love this. It was the Thermopan Man. Yeah, I know, it's really lame. But it's true. That's what they called me. And I would never, ever, ever have admitted it at the time. But I loved it when they called me the Thermopan Man. I did. And the reason why I loved it so much is because it just made me feel like I was doing a good job, and they noticed I was doing a good job. And so it became a little bit of a sense of identity for me in that work that I was doing. Now, why do I tell you all that? Well, I tell you that because there has been a major shift in culture about the way that we view our work and our sense of identity. A sociologist named Peter Berger wrote a book, and he talked about this significant shift in our culture. And he said that, if we were to look back at ancient cultures, even many other cultures in the world today still function this way, especially in Asia. Think about a place like Japan, for instance. He argues that, the number one way that you gain personal significance in your life was through the role that you played in your family or in your community. And so your value, your identity, the personal significance that you felt about yourself, it was all attached to whether you were a good father or a good mother, attached to whether you were a good son or a good daughter, whether you were a good member of society. But things have shifted radically, and so in our Western culture, we are extremely individualistic by nature. Extremely. And so Berger argues that our identity is not based on who you are in your family or who you are in society, but rather our self-esteem, our self-worth, our value is all based on personal achievement. And because of that, we live in a society that has a whole new centrality to work that it didn't have before. And still a lot of other non-Western societies don't have. But your work is how you get your identity. It's who you are. Right? We all know this. The first question someone asks us is, what do you do? Right? Now the consequences of that major shift in our culture is that our work is focused on personal achievement way more than it's focused on the greater good. Our culture tells us that work is a source of identity, and therefore we must do good work to feel good about ourselves. And that is in sharp contrast to the biblical view of work, which is focused on God's call in our lives to live creatively, to live productively for the sake of the greater good, for the sake of adding value to the people around us. And we see this all the time. I mean, we know that things are about personal achievement. Think about it. If you're a high school student that's here today, or maybe you're a young adult, you know That your mind just says, if I can just work really hard for a couple years, get good grades, keep my parents happy, maybe if I'm in high school, just trying to get into that university or college that I want to get into, or maybe if I'm a young adult, that I'm thinking, just trying to get that well-paying job that I really need to provide for, a family down the road or whatever it might be. And then we think to ourselves, if I can just really work hard for a couple years, then I'm going to be set. Right? Then I can kind of slow down. Things are going to be okay. But if you are out of school and you're in the workforce, you know that you think exactly the same thing. Man, if I could just impress my boss those first couple years into my job, if I could achieve something that would kind of make a name for myself, then I'm going to be okay. Right? Maybe you're trying to start up a new business, and hey, those first couple years, they are not going to be profitable. I've just got to work hard, lots of overtime, just put my heart and soul into this thing. And if I can just get the first few years under my belt, will become profitable, then I can just relax. Things are going to be okay. Right? If I've been working at a job for 10 or 20 years, what do I tell myself? Man, if I could just work hard, if I could just keep things going for, 20 years, maybe it's retirement. Maybe you're newly retired, or you're thinking about being retired, or I just know if I can just work hard till I retire, then things are going to slow down. Right? We tell ourselves this, right? Am I right? But the truth is, it doesn't happen that way. You see, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get identity from our work. We're trying to achieve something so that we can feel good about ourselves enough to say, okay, I'm going to slow down. And you know what that need to achieve creates in us? Anxiety. Students anxious about getting good grades, about giving a report in front of the class, about getting into their university of choice, about the likelihood of a high-paying job. Adults anxious about impressing their boss, about losing a client, about keeping a household in order but still parenting well, finishing a report, getting out of a foolish investment, looking like I know what I'm talking about, increasing the bottom line. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you work on the factory floor or you work in the corner office of the 10th story, if you're a pastor or a postal worker, a physicist or a phys ed teacher, the majority of us feel some level of anxiety about our work. Why? Tim Keller, in his book, Every Good Endeavor, which has been kind of a basis for this series, suggests that this is primarily true because of one of the key problems with work. And that's that our work becomes the basis of our identity and meaning. And so then we begin to treat work not the way that God intended, but we treat it selfishly as a means to an end. It's no longer a way to create. It's no longer a way to bring out the created order of the world that God's made. It's no longer a way to serve the needs of our neighbor, but it becomes a way to distinguish myself from my neighbor, to somehow be better than the other guy, to make myself feel better about myself and prove that I'm special somehow. It becomes a way to accumulate power and security, to exercise control over my destiny. I never say the word destiny. And every time I say it, I think of that line from Back to the Future where he says, "Lorraine, you are my density." Yeah. So if our work has this much hanging on to it, our very destiny, then of course it's going to make us anxious. If my work is directly linked to who I am as a person, to my value as a human being, then it's going to have me in a cold sweat most days. Because of course, as Keller says, if work is where we get our identity, then success goes to our head and failure goes to our heart. If work is where we get our identity, then success goes to our head and failure goes to our heart. So you and I aren't the only ones to believe that our self-worth is connected to our work. There is a remarkable example of this in the story of the Tower of Babel. And in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, we talked about this already, the creation of the world. We see that, work is this joyful result of being created in the image of God. filling the earth with good things and culture and neighborhoods and beauty and compassion. Then in chapter 3, Adam and Eve choose to rebel against God, and sin enters the world, and there's brokenness that comes into every single area, including our work. By Genesis chapter 4, we see that technology has become a means to power. Sound familiar? And in Genesis chapter 11, we come to this famous story of the construction of the Tower of Babel. Let me read it for you. Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 to 4. It says, "Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. And they said to each other, 'Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly.' They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. And then they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth.'" Now, if we read this passage, there's two reasons why the people in Shinar decide to build the tower. The first reason is actually kind of neat. It's because they have developed this new form of technology of brick making, and they want to use this innovation to do something really special. And so they decide that they're going to use bricks and tar mortar to build a big city with a huge tower that reaches up into the heavens, it says. Now, that doesn't sound so bad. But if you keep reading, there's actually an even deeper reason, a second reason in verse 4, for them wanting to build this city. And this is what they say. "So let us build our city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we will make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we'll be scattered over the face of the whole earth." So what motivates the workers designing the Tower of Babel? It's the same thing that motivates us so often today. The people of Babel were making plans to build a city with a massive tower because of their radical insecurity. Tim Keller argues that to make a name in the language of the Bible is to construct an identity for ourselves. He writes, "We either get a name, our defining essence, our security, our worth, and our uniqueness from what God has done for us and in us, or we make a name through what we can do for ourselves." And the people here hope that if they could build something of great magnitude, that it would give them a feeling of value and security. That it would lead to feelings of safety and importance that comes from the size and wealth of a big city. But in doing so, they rebelled against God, because God had specifically told human beings to spread out over the earth and to fill the earth with people and culture. But they said no. They specifically say, we want to make a name for ourselves, otherwise we're going to have to spread out over the earth. Rather than making a name for God, they decide that they should be devoted to making a name for themselves. Rather than trusting God for their security, for the provision for their lives, for their very identity, they determined that, like Adam and Eve before them, they would take things into their own hands. And in trying to demonstrate their freedom and their autonomy and their self-sufficiency, ironically, they really show that they're just afraid of not being good enough. And they needed to make a name for themselves outside of the identity that God had already given them as his children. Now, if you're a high school student or a young adult, there is another side to this. And a lot of experts right now have been doing research in this area, and there's a concern that sociologists have. They're identifying a new trend among young adults that they call FNBA. Does anyone know what that stands for? FNBA. It stands for the fear of not being amazing. This is a real thing. The fear of not being amazing. And this idea is rooted in a fear of rejection because you haven't lived up to your own standards or you haven't lived up to the standards of someone else. And it leads a lot of young people to live by this motto: you cannot fail if you didn't try. So it's better not to try. And experts say that they're seeing more and more young people that simply withdraw from expectations when those expectations cause them stress. Young people who withdraw from a job or a task when they don't seem to find the courage to finish that task well. And so we see this fear or anxiety around our identity has huge implications for work. It can cause us to throw ourselves into our work in an attempt to achieve some kind of personal significance. It can even cause us to avoid our work altogether because we've given into this idea that our identity comes from our work, and if we fail at that work somehow, then our identity is at stake. And so in doing that, our work becomes selfish, a means to make a name for ourselves, a place that we look to wrongly to get personal significance, to gain a sense of identity. The people of Shinar wanted to build the tallest tower in the world because they could, as a way to prove their significance. Now you may know for about 32 years, the CN Tower was the tallest freestanding structure in the world, standing at around 1,800 feet. But now many, many structures have overtaken it. And it's a far cry from the Khalifa Tower in Dubai, which holds the record for the tallest tower in the world at 2,700 feet tall. It's interesting to me that thousands of years after the building of the Tower of Babel, humans continue to construct towers as a vivid example of this competitive pride and search for significance. Now, don't get me wrong. These towers are amazing, and they're maybe not bad in and of themselves. In fact, they provide us with all kinds of innovation that's helpful for our lives. But there's something else going on there too, isn't there? They serve as a symbol of our spiritual neediness. In 1894, both Canada and the United States declared Labor Day to be a national holiday. And in 1956, the U.S. created this stamp. You may have seen it before. It's a blue stamp with a guy on it. He's got a pickaxe and a shovel and a bunch of heavy things over his arms. He's like really ripped. Anyway, you'll see it. It's an interesting stamp. At the bottom of the stamp, there is a phrase by a Scottish philosopher named Thomas Carlyle. And all it says at the bottom of the stamp is, "Labor is life." Labor is life. Now, how you and I interpret that statement is really at the crux of our discussion for this biblical understanding of work. In Thomas Carlyle's book entitled Labor, he says this. He says, "Blessed is he who has found work, for there is perennial nobleness and even sacredness in work." Now, Carlyle understood that there was something spiritual about work, but if you read more of his writings, you realize that what he got wrong was that the sacredness of our work was not coming kind of from deep inside ourselves. You know, the sacredness of our work, all of our work, paid and unpaid work, was coming from how God designed us to interact with the world around us. So if work is broken and it's driven by our desire to achieve and to create self-worth, it's a result of our selfishness and our fear of not being amazing, then what should our response be? What should our response be? So let me just suggest a couple of things really quickly about a possible response for the Christian person. First of all, if I call myself a Christian, then I need to engage in a practice of repeatedly reevaluating the motives for my work. This is a discipline that we just don't have. Whether I'm at school or at home with the kids, whether I'm cleaning buildings or working at a not-for-profit or I'm a CEO of a multi-million-dollar company. I mean, it doesn't matter if I make self-tying shoes or if I make self-healing concrete. It doesn't matter if I change babies' diapers or if I, take photos for the school yearbook or if I write papers on asymmetry. Bazinga. Because when my work, no matter how simple or how complex it is, becomes a way for me to fill a need that I have to feel better about myself, I'm working for the wrong reasons. Psalm 127 says this. It says, "Unless the Lord builds a house, the work of the builders is wasted." It is useless for you to work so hard from early morning until late at night, anxiously working for food to eat. For God gives rest to those he loves. There's an implication here in this passage that God can perform more good for those who trust him while they sleep than they can perform with anxious labor for themselves while they're awake. See, God doesn't need you to work. He's capable of redeeming the earth completely on his own. He's capable of filling the earth with people and culture completely on his own. But rather, he has awarded you and I the opportunity to do good work. Not to make a name for ourselves, but to make his name known by filling the earth with beauty and creativity and compassion. So tomorrow, when you go to the classroom, or to the office, or to the garage, or to the laundry room, what will your reason be for going to work? We need to constantly reevaluate those motives. Are we working for some need to make us feel special, or fulfill a need of some loss that we've had, or someone who told us that we weren't doing a good job? Or are we working for the good of those around us? Are we working in partnership with God the way he's created us to work? Secondly, as Christians, we have a responsibility to demonstrate balance between our working and non-working lives. This is a tough one. Ecclesiastes chapter 4 says this, "And I saw that all toil and all achievement sprang from one person's envy of another." Again, it's that achievement again. "This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind." Verse 5, "Fools fold their hands and ruin themselves. Better one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind." Let me say that again. Fools fold their hands. Better one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. Now, what does that mean? King Solomon reminds us that God has indeed designed us to do good work. But he argues that a person who chooses not to work at all, who folds his or her hands, that they rebel against God's call to fill the earth with good things, and therefore fail to experience the joys of a godly life. Similarly, the person who places all of their hope for fulfillment and satisfaction and provision in their work is simply placing themselves into this never-ending cycle where there's little happiness or fulfillment. The scriptures say better is one hand with work and tranquility, a peace that comes from God, a balance of work and life, than two handfuls with toil, chasing after the wind. Work too little or too much, and we threaten to ruin what God has created for good. And Solomon uses this helpful image of the hands, folded hands, a sign of laziness that lead to no good. Two handfuls of toil that lead to a tiresome and exhausted life with little balance and ultimately less impact. But one handful of work, an appropriate and measured desire to fill God's earth, results in God's peace, in wholeness and completeness and peace that comes from God himself. And so if we're Christians, we have to have a better balance with regards to our work than we see in the world. Lastly, our work serves our relationships, not the other way around. This is really key. God has strategically designed us to be interdependent. In other words, we are dependent on one another. We look out for one another. We meet each other's needs. And you'll look throughout the scriptures, there's all kinds of texts that talk about the way that we are meant to rely on one another and care for one another. And this is an uncommon view in today's society. Keller suggests that the modern idol of individualism has raised work from being a good thing to nearly a form of salvation. And so we live in a society that tells us if something can be done, it will be done, without often thinking about whether or not it should be done. Advertisers have shifted away from telling us about the benefits of their products to promising that their products will bring us happiness and identity. And so we have lost sight of the reason that we work. not to achieve, not to make more money, but to partner with God in his love and care for the world. Our work is informed by our relationship with God, with our family, and with our communities. Our relationship with God determines a basis for our work, to live out our created purpose, to make his name great and not our own. But our relationship with our families and our communities motivate us to work in a way that adds value to people's lives. And you may make a ton of money, but are you adding value to people's lives? If you read both of these texts, Psalm 127 and Ecclesiastes 4, you can read them later because we don't have time. But if you continue to read those passages, both of them talk about work at the beginning and then go down and talk about relationship and connect those things incredibly strongly. I'll just close with this. There's a gentleman named Dr. Lofty Belkier, and he's actually a professor at McMaster University, and he was recently at a presentation about innovation that I attended. And he talks about innovation bringing social value. And he offered this example. He says, IBM has a value of somewhere in the neighborhood of $100 billion. And it's known to secure more patents per year than any other company in the world. Facebook, on the other hand, has never invented a thing. But they have a market value of around $400 billion, 4 times IBM. Now, IBM has more patents than Facebook, Google, and Apple combined. And he argues, and you might disagree with his take on this, but he argues that Facebook and Google and Apple bring far more value to society, even though they have invented nothing, than IBM, who has invented many more things. Dr. Belker suggests that knowledge, specifically technical knowledge and invention, is like a deep ocean. And each new invention, new patent that we get, it's like throwing another bucket of water into that sea. But figuring out how to manipulate the water to make waves is what's important. Because the waves add impact and value to people's lives. Now, I have no idea if Dr. Belkier is a Christian. I have no idea if he, believes in this idea of work as things we're created to do and the call to fill the earth. I have no idea, but he's got something right. That just doing stuff for the sake of doing stuff does not have a lot of value. God might still use it. But value comes when we make waves, when we add value and life to the people around us. Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones is a well-known physician turned pastor who preached and taught from the late 1920s to the early 80s. And when he was talking about some of the doctors that he used to work with, he once said that many of them would have on their tombstone, born a man, died a doctor. You see, because he knew for many of us that our work, unpaid or paid, becomes our identity. And the anxiety of hanging our very identity on the successes and failures of our work can be immobilizing. God says, rather, in Psalm 127, that it is useless for us to anxiously work for our food to eat. See, our work should be shaped by our identity as children of God first and foremost. People created to work, created to make his name great, created to add value to the lives of those around us.